This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Jeff Dubrow. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. Nadishani Perera, Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Welcome to Human Coin.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to see you again, albeit not in person this time. Let's start the podcast interview. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your organizations so that our listeners can get familiar.
Sure. So we are Transparency International Sri Lanka, the national chapter of Transparency International, the global anti-corruption movement. It's been there for over 30 years and present in over 100 countries. So our mission is basically to contribute to the collective effort to eradicate just over 20 years now. And then we do the strategic planning with our stakeholders, and our current strategy involves working in all sectors. And when I say all stakeholders, multi-sectoral approach to eradicating corruption, because it has to be a collective effort. So, you're talking about politicians and political system to very grassroots level, people and cultural change to private sector to public sector. Also, we are predominantly an advocacy organization. We are there on media. We put our press conferences. We we also would be doing a legislative brief. So it's diverse. And also lately we've also been engaged in public interest. Not lately, we've been doing it lately more, I would say, in public interest litigation, because pushing against moves to suppress civic space and the democratic principles, which are essential enablers in order to fight corruption, essential enablers to have a transparent context. So this is basically a very short description of my organization.
Thank you. Today we're talking about oversight of IMF agreements. Why don't you start us off by talking a little bit about the circumstances in the last couple of years that led to the signing of an IMF extended fund facility with the government of Sri Lanka?
I would like to bring in the latest landmark case that the Supreme Court delivered, where along with TRSL, a couple of petitioners, we went to court asking the court to look into the decisions taken by those responsible for the economy, very at the highest levels, including the central bank, and to look whether these decisions were taken in line with their duties, following due process, because it seemed that at one point, if you look at the independent economies, the opposition and others were literally crying out and warning the government not to take certain courses of action, because you could literally see are going to hit a zero. And they just completely disregarded this sound advice, and just went on their whatever plan, which ended up, and finally in January paying this 500 million bond, which ended up with country having to declare bankruptcy. The cost to people it's unbearable. It's huge. It will take years for us to recover. So we said that there has to be accountability. It can't be. It was not a natural disaster that led to this. So Supreme Court in its landmark judgment held that these parties, the president, the finance minister, central bank governor, monetary, these parties were responsible because they were acted in breach of the public trust that was entrusted to them in taking those decisions. That led to the particular situation of the country, which is important because this is very high level accountability. And it is also Supreme Court questioning the policymakers in a sense, because there has to be a check and balance in power, because where else can citizens go if the parties to whom we have entrusted governance, entrusted our sovereign right as citizens to take decisions regarding public resources, if they act not in the best interest of the country, citizens need to have accountability on their judgment, and that brings to, then you almost see that IMF is now coming in at this point and having to negotiate with parties that are also responsible for the crisis as well. Because from a political point of view, you also know that with economic crisis, there was the unprecedented people's uprising in Sri Lanka. Unprecedented in terms of the scale, but in terms of the nature, it was peaceful. It was led by the youth, and with one call asking for a system change, because people made the connection between the crisis and poor governance, with the crisis and corruption. In fact, for TRSL, we call this amazing social awakening that we've never seen in our 20 years of our work, where people finally made that connection between their day-to-day lives, businesses, their day-to-day ability to run their business, and grand corruption. So that was really important. So the IMF has to then think, with whom are they having this agreement, and we can discuss further on as we go forward.
Absolutely. And so if we go back and we trace the steps from what you've described so far, we started with an economic crisis that has been, as you said, has really been perpetual in terms of the government spending, and this led to a default on the debt. And as you described it, the same government that defaulted then was responsible for solely negotiating an agreement with the International Monetary Fund to get them out of that situation, which is a little bit of a conflict of interest situation in a sense. The purpose of this discussion is on the monitoring of the agreement, because IMF agreements in themselves are far from perfect, but I think one of the things that I've noticed is that they tend to bring together a number of key reforms that required no less than anti-corruption legislation itself. With Nadishani, you'd be perfectly qualified to talk about, of course. But as I've mentioned, a number of countries in the Caribbean, for example, and other parts of the world have monitoring groups that are formally formed by the government, civil society, the public sector, and trade unions. How helpful would that have been in the context of Sri Lanka's agreement with the IMF? Were you disappointed that this wasn't something that was provided for in the agreement?
Sure. Well, when you asked whether I was disappointed, well, I wouldn't say I was or I am disappointed. Now, if you look at the governance diagnostic that was done by civil society, led of us led it. I mean, we have a section on implementation, monitoring, evaluation, where we talk about the desirability of a possible joint mechanism. I mean, because again, our report comes from after a lot of consultation from different stakeholders around the country. And this is something people said, that we are so fed up of all these great sounding initiatives being brought, laws, policies, and nothing happening at the end of it, no implementation or ineffective, or you have unequal implementation. So there has to be some way you monitor this. So it is natural to say, let's come up with a established independent mechanism. We've said it, but we didn't go hard on pushing it. From my end, I would say, because of the inherent problems we have in all the so-called independent institutions in this country. Now, I am saying we definitely need, okay, we have the Constitutional Council, the independent commissions, but there's a problem. They have been given a very difficult situation to deal with. You have the government continuously creates a disabling environment for the functioning of these independent commissions. Now, twofold. There's one side of under-resourcing them, right? And so it sounds good, but if you talk to them, they're like literally asking, I cannot, you don't even have a printer, very practical needs to expertise. And then you have the question of independence. If the government has a say, like you want to put one or two people, and often there is a weightage. In fact, we have a proposal in our diagnostic that the Constitutional Council the composition need to improve, because at the end of the day, the government gets a majority. So the question is, what's the balance in that so-called independent institution? And secondly, say all of that is there. Okay, they have resources. They've been appointed in an independent way. You create a chilling effect by the way you deal with independent commission, by the statements when you say you, I'm talking to the executive, I'm talking to the legislature. We have many examples in the last couple of months where the independent commissioners dare to question the decisions of the executive. Actually, that's their job, right? They are supposed to, if you take the Public Utilities Commission, or if you take the Election Commission, they were given a very hard time. Social media backlash, threats, or actually being called to, even the Supreme Court, even the court. At one point, the parliament was saying they need to be called for violating parliamentary privileges because they have that the local money need to be released for the local government election. When we went to court after the postponement of the election, and the way the Public Utilities Commission chairman was removed. Now, whether we personally like him or not, it's not my problem here. It's the process. It's the chilling effect. If you look at the arrest, the way the law is being applied, the way the ICCPR Act in Sri Lanka is being abused, the new bills that are being brought, then you are creating not an environment that people will go into self-censorship. People will worry. So then in this context, to add another institution may not be the best way. We are anyway going to monitor this. We are monitoring. We are in consultation. We are in conversation with the necessary institutions that are responsible for the different recommendations, pushing each and every recommendation wherever we can, certainly, and also we are transparent about it, and we will continue to do this because you can't rely on the government to be monitoring the implementation of the governance anti-corruption reform. And IMF does its part, but they might not be very, they don't really communicate well about it, I would say. So I'll rest that to finish off. We are working on having like a online tracker of the government diagnostic recommendations, and IMF tracker is already there. Verited Research is having one. In terms of the structural benchmarks, we're going to planning to add the governance reforms of both the diagnostic and start tracking, so normal or citizens can also have a look at it. So this way we have more freedom, and that might be better. And this is probably not often said out in openly, but you also have a situation of co-opting. That's a very smart way of breaking a group. Yeah. We see that happening. I mean, to win a war, people do that. That didn't have happened in Sri Lanka.
I was just going to say a war cabinet. That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. You co-opt parties, and so all these additional problems you have to deal with when you come up with this institution and this. Yeah.
So let's talk about that diagnostic before we go further, because it's been mentioned several times. Could you maybe, Nadishani, could you start by just telling us a bit about what that diagnostic was?
When the IMF decided to conduct a governance diagnostic, they did have consultations with civil society and other actors. And in that initial consultations, they explained what is the scope of their governance diagnostic, which was this framework they have, 2018, if I'm right. They have 6 pillars. Now, looking at our country's state of governance and corruption, which TISL has come forward during the crisis period and said that we are in a kleptocratic situation. In fact, we are in state capture, was the first form of corruption. That framework falls short of actually capturing the root causes in a state captured country, right? So what we tried to show the IMF is that it can actually be counterproductive for them to come up with a diagnostic that deals with a lower level of, indicators and recommendations when the big problem is not going to be touched. So a very simple example I keep saying is, you have a house coming down situation, and here you are giving recommendation of how to fix a table or a door. The house is crashing. Right. And What we said was, do no harm principle. You come up with this, government will happily accept this, tick all the boxes and say, we did all the governance reforms. Now we negotiated. Now while they accept whatever we say, their stance was that we are limited in terms of our mandate and our scope. So this is the max we can do. So then we were like, this is a really important opportunity for us to lay down the reform agenda, anti-corruption reform agenda for Sri Lanka. It is a moment where the government is weak enough to consider some of these reforms, which are counterproductive to those who are corrupt, and which there is international heavy focus on reform, and where people are also demanding reform, anti-corruption reform, but nobody really knows what do you mean by system change. It was the slogan in our Araganian uprising, but if somebody asks what is system change, that was not readily available. This was the time to come up with very clear targets, very clear doable actions, so that also the government can't say lies like, yeah, we're doing reforms and nobody, confuse you here. So then we thought we'll step in, and also the consultation process of IMF cannot be considered adequate at all in terms of talking to the people of Sri Lanka, right? So we wanted our one to be representative of the voices of the people. So of course, the challenge for us was that if we are to gain mileage, we had to put our one out before the IMF one, at least within that time period. So that gave us only a couple of months, but we had a consultant, engage a senior consultant, Professor Parakram, and he went around the country, spoke to diverse people. And of course, we have a lot of expertise within the country. If you're talking about public sector reform, public financial management, anti-corruption, all of that. And this is how this came about. So this is, and also it's a really great, I think, outcome that the 6 organizations came together. Now, if you look at the 6 organizations that led this process, TISL, CPA, we have the PAFRL, they are focused on elections. We have National Peace Council focused on reconciliation. We have Verity Research, think tank, economic. You have these people who were working on different aspects, coming together, agreeing that this is first. Without this governance and anti-corruption reform, there's no point talking about other things like you won't get rights, you won't get democracy. Let's do this together. And then we consulted the largest civil society, hundreds of them, and told them in the beginning we are doing this, and they were happy about it, get them involved, got them engaged. And because this has to be, we are just doing the work, but it is all of our effort. So this is the outcome of this. And of course, we kept IMF informed, we are doing it. And we engage, the conversations continued. And I think we exerted a lot of pressure as much as we could to improve, tell them to improve, because after all, you're going to come up with a high quality one. So you had to step up and do something that shows the big picture. And I believe we, compared to where the conversation started, when we saw their diagnostic, we were quite pleased. I mean, I know it can be better, but it was better than what was originally envisaged. So we are happy that we feel there was some positive impact of our diagnostic as well. And now we have this set of reforms that are very complementing in nature, and which gives a very clear roadmap. If there is political will now to do the reform, to make it difficult for the kleptocrats to continue to damage the country, here are things that we must do. Like, without this, increasing revenue will not help Jeff, because it will still come into this bucket with holes, waste, fraud, and corruption. And it will not go down, and it will not really retrieve the economy. So we can go back to IMF in a couple of years.
This is riveting stuff. Nadishani, maybe you could talk about the anti-corruption legislation. That was certainly one of the criteria for in the IMF agreement. And if I understand, there was some, I think it was actually at the time when I was visiting Colombo, that there was provisions put in that legislation that were actually counterproductive to the eradication of corruption in Sri Lanka. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes. I mean, overall, compared to what we had in terms of the anti-corruption legal regime, this new act tries to consolidate it and also fill in any gaps and come up with a legal regime that can actually at least try to counter the corruption that is very sophisticated, use state-of-the-art technology, very well coordinated, 10 steps or more than that ahead of those who are trying to now, combat corruption. Our laws were outdated. So this does, and it more or less, there are positive elements if you're asking about the law. Yes, there were some provisions we tried to challenge, and but we did not succeed in changing. That is with regard to the ability to take action against those who file a so-called false complaint. Now there are, so you can end up in prison, but it is up to the bribery commission, very short call in the bribery commission, the anti-corruption agency. If they feel that the law says, if they think that a particular party with malicious intent, without having any evidence, just for wrongful intent to harm somebody's reputation or whatever, files this complaint, and if they go into it and find there's nothing in it and you just wanted to give trouble to these people, that's the situation in which they can take that action. So they were saying, it's a very, rare situation, need to have it, because people who come up with false, this is the counter argument. Now, our point was that in a country where good laws, good provisions are abused, the classic example again being the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Act. It is meant to enhance our civil and political rights, and it is being used against freedom of expression, badly. Now, then when you have this kind of a subject to interpretation problematic provision, you're kind of creating pathways, giving ideas to these people. Instead, what we said was that a good anti-corruption law should have some provisions that seriously encourage us and protect whistleblowers. And you cannot expect in a country like Sri Lanka with this extreme opacity in terms of access to information, for that person filing a complaint to know everything. And that's the duty of the bribery commission and the police, to get all the information. If you have a reasonable suspicion, you should be able to, be a whistleblower. But there was, at the end of the day, this is there. Now it is up to us to be alert, and if it at any point is being abused, we'll have to expose it, but deal with it. But the positive provisions are there. For example, it introduces private sector corruption, sports-related corruption, sexual bribery, things like that we have been advocating for a long time. Asset declaration, transparency. However, there are a lot of steps that needs to be taken for that to be actually implemented. Now, the very first step was to appoint the commissioners. That was done. Now we know that the commissioners the bribery commission is trying to reaching out to donors, asking funding for the electronic asset declaration system, which is a centerpiece of this legislation. It has to have a digitalized system where all countries' asset declarations of public officials and politicians will come there. And there has to be a red flag system and things like that. But sadly, we didn't even see money being allocated in the budget for this. So, you're like, if you brought in this law and you're boasting about it, then you need to see that you actually have an action plan to implement. Now, I'm glad that the IMF has required an action plan for all of the reforms. And I hope, again, that won't be, just like you say, Jay, just an exception of a piece of paper, which looks like a brilliant action plan. At each milestone, if it's not implemented, then there has to be a repercussion. Otherwise, it's just another paperwork. It will be paperwork. So
Yes, and you've said a couple of things that really are I find riveting. The first is just the state capacity for corruption is something I've never thought of it that way, because we like to think of state capacity as state capacity to provide public services, not capacity and systems in place to steal money. So that I find that absolutely riveting. But it's also interesting, many of the countries I work in, I think most countries have lots of plans that are not costed. When you look at a budget, the budget does not include often the national development plan is not costed, and if you're saying that the steps in the action plan have not been costed, that is definitely a major omission. I sort of wonder how it's possible for the government to implement the action plan if the costs haven't been associated with it. I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I can't. It's hard for me to explain how much I've learned from this conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I have tremendous respect for the work that you do in Sri Lanka and for the civil society as a whole. It's quite amazing, and I realize that you have your work cut out for you. So I really do appreciate your time. Nadishani Perera, Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. I don't want to say best of luck to you, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and all the best for your paper.
Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.